So tonight we're in chapter 23, and we're going to be talking about how Paul now goes from just simply, being on his own, doing pretty much what he wanted. Now he's really going to be in Roman hands. From this point forward in Acts chapter 23, from that chapter forward, we see that Paul is pretty much there. I know that, in chapter 22, he was taken custody with the centurion, but that was just kind of a little bit of a transitional thing. But what we're going to see is starting in chapter 23, that idea about him being in Roman hands is kind of solidified. And what this is going to be important to do is, it is really going to ensure that Paul is going to be where God wants him to be. Now, maybe you know this. I wouldn't be surprised if you did know this, because it's really kind of what book of Acts is all about. But where does God want Paul? In Rome. Absolutely.
Gentiles.
What's that?
Teaching the Gentiles.
Teaching the Gentiles, but more than that, God wanted Paul in Rome. And if you recall that when he was back in Ephesus, he decided that he was going to go to Jerusalem. And then after that, he said, I must see Rome also. And so this is not something that is, just coming upon Paul all of a sudden. It's something that I think that the Lord has been, dealing with and implanting in Paul's heart, that he needed to go to Rome. And, I guess Paul in Ephesus decided, this is the route that I'm going to take. But what we're going to see is that the Lord had an entirely different route for him to take. And that route that God had for him to take is eventually going to lead to the point to where he is going to testify before Caesar, which would not have been possible if he would have gone the direction that he wanted. And so I guess there's a little bit of lesson there to learn, and that is that, sometimes we think, yes, this is where I want, God wants me to go, and this is where I'm going to get there. But God has the tendency to direct us in the path that we need to go, and that's the best one, because that's really going to accomplish what God intends for it. Okay, and so that if you can think of it like a slippery slope and then just falling into the well, and that path down into the well and then hitting the bottom is going to be Rome. That chapter 21, 22, he's slipping and sliding, but then here we see in chapter 23, he's over the edge, and then it's a long plummet for the next couple of chapters until he gets there in chapter 28. Okay. So if you recall, what happened to Paul up to this point is that he went to Jerusalem, he met with the elders and the apostles there of the Jerusalem church. They advised him to go and pay the vows that some of the Jewish Christians had taken. And so Paul was in the temple, he was doing that, he has purified himself. But some Jews from the province of Asia Minor saw him and also had seen Trophimus, who was a Gentile, and thought that Paul was taking him into the temple area. And so this riot resulted. You remember that the commander came, rescued Paul from the riot. Paul stood on the steps, made his defense last week in chapter 22. And then from that blow up, that after Paul said that he was going to be sent to the Gentiles, that the commander was taking him inside the fortress where he was going to flog him to try to get down to the root of what was going on, to which Paul said, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't do this. And so because of that, what we see is that, number one, he doesn't get beat, but in chapter 22, in verse number 30, which is really a better place for this chapter to start, what we see is that now it says the next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priest and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. And so what we see is that moving into chapter 23, in the very first part, verses 1 through 11, we see that Paul stands before the Sanhedrin court. And the Sanhedrin court, if you recall, is the highest court of the land in Israel. It's going to be comprised of 70 elders of Israel, and the chief priest is going to be the one that is going to be presiding over it. Okay? So, in verses 1 through 5, we see that Paul now has this interaction with his chief priest Ananias. Now, this chief priest Ananias is new to us in Bible history. I mean, what we saw as far as the chief priest in Jesus' day, what were their names? You remember? Close to Ananias, Caiaphas, that's one of us. There's two of them. Caiaphas was the acting chief priest, and the other one was kind of the chief priest emeritus. Annas, okay? And so you may have heard chief priest Annas and think, hey, wait a minute, this guy is Ananias. Is it the same guy? No, it's not. It's different guys. Annas and Caiaphas were like father-in-law and son-in-law to each other. But Ananias, he's somebody totally different. Okay? All right, so here he is. He's there with the Sanhedrin, and he looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." I think that is a very strong statement to make, and I think that what made it even stronger is that Paul very much meant it. He was very sincere. When you think about having a good conscience, what is that? Have you ever thought about that? A conscience is knowing what's right, and then a good conscience is doing what's right, And so a bad conscience is you know what's right and you don't do what's right. So that's a bad conscience. Paul is saying, I've had a good conscience to this day. Now, does this mean that Paul was perfect? By no means. And it doesn't mean that he didn't consider himself to be a sinner, because what we see in the book of 1 Timothy is that Paul said that he was the chiefest of all sinners. So it's not that Paul is standing up here and by saying, I've lived with a good conscience before God up unto this day. He's not saying, I'm perfect, I'm sinless, I'm better than you, or anything like that. He is really just saying, as we look at it, he's saying, I fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience this day. And so, in other words, he's saying, God has wanted me to do something. And, not saying that Paul hadn't had any failures with it, but he had lived doing that duty up until this day. And, that's one thing that might be a good thing for us to remember. And that is that the Lord does have things for us to do. Certainly not on the scale of what Paul has, but if we'll just simply do what God has for us to do on a day-to-day basis, then at a certain time we can step back and we can look back and say, even though I've had faults and failures and troubles, I at least have tried to do my duty before God. And in that we can say that we have a good conscience. Okay? So that all sounds good, doesn't it? But it strikes a nerve to the high priest, because I think that the high priest maybe did not have a good conscience. Maybe deep down his conscience condemned him. And so it said, at this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Now, doesn't that sound familiar with Jesus? Because when Jesus was being tried by a different high priest, it was the same thing that happened. Now, it was illegal with the law of Moses for somebody who had not been condemned to be struck, and it was illegal for Jesus today. It is illegal for Paul as well, as far as this trial for Paul. And so in verse number 3, boy, Paul just let loose on the guy. He says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me in according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Okay? Now, what do you suppose that Paul meant when he said a whitewashed wall?
Tomb.
Probably a tomb. And so what they did was they had tombs, and the doorway to the tomb they would paint white for visibility, so that when passerby would be walking and everything, they would see that white stone that was there, and they'd know that's a tomb, don't touch it, because if they did, they would be ceremonially or defiled. And so, here's this whitewashed tomb. In other words, here's a clean exterior, but inside you've got all kinds of dead things in there. And so, where Paul is calling the high priest a whitewashed wall, he's probably saying, you have a very good exterior to you, a very righteous exterior, but inside you are full of uncleanliness. You are full of sin and wickedness. He's really pointing out the hypocrisy of him. And, he's saying, here you stand me, judging me according to the law, but you yourself are breaking the law as you are judging me by it. You see it? Do you see a little problem with that? I do too. But what happens after that is we see in verse number 4, those who were standing near Paul said, "You dare insult God's high priest?" I think that maybe they were saying that because they were thinking, hey, maybe we can hit him again. But in verse number 5, Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" And I don't know if Paul was sincere in that. Maybe he really didn't know that he was the high priest. Or maybe, he just realized, I've kind of gone a little bit too far. I need to kind of backtrack a little bit. I don't know what Paul intended by that. But anyway, what we see is that starting in verse number 6, Paul has a very good strategy laid out. And so in verse number 6, it says, "Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisee, called out in the Sanhedrin." Now, by the way, kind of pausing right there, we think when we read in the Gospels, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we want to put them together, okay? But what we need to understand is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were two different political, socioeconomic, and religious factions in Israel, and they hated each other. It's almost like the Republicans and Democrats today in the Congress. The Pharisees and the Sadducees did not like each other, and so this is Paul reading the room. He's seeing, hey, wait a minute, I got Sadducees over here, and I've got Pharisees over here, and so this is what he says. He says, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead." Okay? Now, we've got a little bit of an explanation there in verse number 7. It says, "When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all." And so to a Pharisee, when you say, hey, there's going to be a resurrection of the dead, the Pharisees would be all on it. Yeah, there's going to be a resurrection of the dead. But the Sadducees, on the other hand, they're going to take issues with this. And there's not going to be a resurrection of the dead. What are you talking about? The Sadducees were kind of like the liberals of the day, and the Pharisees were kind of like the conservatives of the day. And the Pharisees wanted to hang on to Jewish traditional teaching, which has, in the Old Testament, talks about the resurrection of the dead. But the Sadducees, they were influenced by Greeks, and they were influenced by the Romans. And if you recall, when Paul went to Mars Hill on Athens, and they listened to him up until he got to the point about talking about the resurrection of the dead, what happened then? Do you remember? They scoffed at him. They thought it was ridiculous because all across the Grecian world, they thought the resurrection was foolishness. And so, that kind of thinking had gotten its way into the Sadducees and into their theology. And so, here we got a dispute that's going on, right? And so the whole assembly is completely divided. As a matter of fact, when you go and you take a look at the next couple of verses, in verses 9 and 10, you see the effectiveness of what Paul's strategy was all about. In verse number 9, it says, "There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. 'We find nothing wrong with this man,' they said. 'What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And so you talk about, Paul just playing these people like a fiddle. I mean, we got Pharisees, we got Sadducees. I'm going to side with one of them. I'm a Pharisee. I'm the son of a Pharisee, which actually was true. I mean, Paul's not saying anything that isn't right. Okay, and I'm here on the resurrection of the hope of the resurrection for the dead. All of a sudden, you could just see the polarization of both sides. All of a sudden, this no longer becomes about Paul, does it? This becomes about this greater debate and this greater issue, right? And so now all of a sudden, these Pharisees that probably would have taken issue with Paul are now buddied up with him. We're defending this guy because he's one of us. And these other people, they're attacking the Pharisees instead of attacking Paul. And don't you love that that little thing there in verse number 9, where they stood up and said, we find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? You remember that the Pharisees acknowledge angels and spirits. The Sadducees, no, there's no angels or spirits. And so, you can tell that the Pharisee teachers are saying that just because they want to needle the other group, right? Okay. Now, here's a question for you. Why was Paul there? Why was Paul on trial?
They thought he started a riot.
But he didn't, did he? I mean, when you stop and think about why was Paul there, what was he doing wrong, what charges are against him, we really don't know at this point still, okay? The commander, when he had a hold of Paul, he didn't know. That's why he was wanting to beat him, to find out. And after he realized, no, that's not going to work, that's why he called this council of the Sanhedrin together to try to figure it out, right? And you really don't know. Now, if you think about why the riot originally started, why did the riot originally start? It's because they thought Paul had defiled the temple, right? That has nothing to do with the resurrection of the dead, does it? Okay? They thought that Paul had gone about and was teaching against the law of Moses. Okay? Right? Okay? But then when he gave his defense, here he was talking about Jesus until he said, I'm going to be going away to the Gentiles, or God had sent me to be a teacher of the Gentiles, and that's where it erupted again. So it's almost like the first issue, the first reason for the riot is now null and void. Now there's a new reason for a riot, and that is that Paul is teaching the Gentiles. Okay? Now what we see happening there is now that is going out the window, and now there's going to be something new that's coming in place, and that is that in verse number 10, the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. And so, this is not this is not just simply, a disagreement. I mean, this is getting very violent that's going on there. And so now all of a sudden, it's no longer about Paul being a teacher to the Gentiles, is it? Now he's on hope for the resurrection of the dead. Okay? Now, when you kind of fast forward, and as we start to go through this, we're going to see that there really is not a good reason why Paul is imprisoned. Okay? There's not a specific reason about what happens. Now, later on, when the lawyers come up to Caesarea, which we're going to get into later on, they do have some specific charges, but there's not, anything that's going to really hold water. And where he goes and presents his case before Caesar, all the things that they had mentioned, it's really not going to, amount to anything necessarily. But when Paul said that he is there by the hope of the resurrection of the dead, was he really being real and serious about it, or was he just kind of trying to say something to get everybody upset? He was really saying something that was real, wasn't it? Okay, because when we have to stop and think about, why Paul is doing all the things that he's doing. Why was he there in the temple to begin with? Why was he there teaching the Gentiles? So when you think about, why Paul was there, he was there by the resurrection of the dead. This is what he was doing. He was all the things in his life, whether it was him being in the temple or whether it was him going to the Gentiles or whatever, it was in the fact that he knew that the resurrection of the dead was going to be happening. He knew that because his belief in Jesus Christ, he was going to be part of it. And so therefore, just like what he talked about in Philippians chapter 3, all the former things of his life he had just discarded into the dung heap, and now he is there for the hope of knowing Jesus Christ and the future glory that he's going to receive. And so he's not just simply telling a lie here. I mean, this is real. This is what's really going on, right? Okay. So what we see is that Paul gets taken away from them. And in verse number 11, this is really kind of a very key verse. It says, "The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, 'Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.'" And so there's that key right there. You are going to be going to Rome. This is where he thought he was going to be going in Ephesus. This is where he thought he was going to go after Jerusalem, but yet he thought, if you remember, when he met with the Ephesian elders as he was on his way to Jerusalem, he said that you're not going to see my face again, and that he was ready to die there in Jerusalem. And so I think that Paul was thinking, the end of my life is going to be in Jerusalem. But Paul is saying no, or excuse me, Jesus is saying no, take courage, Paul. You're going to testify about me in Rome just as you have in Jerusalem. And so what that's going to do for Paul is, hey, you know what? I've got more work to do. I'm going to be alive until at least I get to Rome, And so however this is going to take, it's going to happen. Okay, so starting in verse number 12, we see another little section of what happens in this chapter. Which, again, to me is a really interesting little thing, and that is that there was a plot formed to kill Paul. So, starting in verse number 12 through 15, we see what happens. It says, "The next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul." Okay, now look at the scope of this. In verse number 13, it says, "More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, 'We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now, then you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets there.'" And so if you think about 40 men who are so motivated and so serious about this that they're saying, we are not going to eat or drink anything until we have fulfilled this. This is an oath that we are taking before God. God, we swear we're not going to eat anything or drink anything until that we have completed our task. And so, you've got 40 men, and you've got 40 men who are very well motivated to do this, right? Okay. So, what are the chances of success? I mean, this is a pretty serious situation, Just hey, this is in on it with the chief priest, and that is, just have Paul come, just call him before the Sanhedrin, just like before, and when the Romans are coming, then we're just going to pounce on them in a certain place, and we're going to get to Paul. Okay. But here is a little bit of a kerfunkel that happens in a plan, a little bit of a wrinkle, and that is that this plot gets exposed in verse number 16. It says, "But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot," now isn't that interesting? It's Paul's nephew, right? And so we don't hear about Paul's family at all in the book of Acts, and then all of a sudden we've got his nephew that's there. And, where is Paul's nephew? How does he hear about this? He's obviously a kid, is what we're about to read, but somehow he gets wind of this. And so what happens is, in verse number 17, it says, well, in verse number 16, he went to the barracks and told Paul about this plot. Verse 17, it says, Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. Now, why are the centurions and the commander so interested in helping out Paul?
Because he's Roman.
Because he's a Roman citizen. There we go again. And so, again, you see the idea about how that Paul is in the hands of the Romans is going to be really kind of solidifying his course to get to where God wants him to be. So what we see is he took him to the commander, and the centurion said, Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked for me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. And the commander took the young man by the hand and drew him aside and asked, what is it that you want to tell me? And so, we can see that he's a kid here, right? And so in verse number 20, he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath to eat or not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are now ready, waiting for your consent to their request. So the commander dismissed the young man and cautioned him, don't tell anyone that you've reported this to me. You got to keep yourself safe out there. And so now all of a sudden the commander's got a certain situation on his hand, right? Why does the commander care about this? Because again, he is a Roman citizen. Plus, he's there tasked with keeping the peace. And so, if as he's bringing Paul, all of a sudden 40 men try to pounce on Paul, what are the Romans going to try to do? Defend him, and so there's going to be bloodshed that's there, right? And all of a sudden this thing could just completely blow up and erupt. And so this is what he does. Starting in verse number 23, what we see is that he makes these preparations to leave. In verse 23, it says, he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. In other words, we got to get a very large force together, and we've got to get out of town very quickly. Now, think about the amount of firepower that's here, right? You've got 200 soldiers, and then you've got an additional 200, what it says, spearmen. Now, you think, well, what are spearmen? Well, that's a good question. It's kind of a very ambiguous term. So, what is a spearman? It could be that a spearman would have been a light infantryman. And so soldiers may have been like more heavily armed and armored infantry. It could be that the spearmen were soldiers that would have had a spear, and they would have a shield, and they would have been more lightly, able to maneuver. But you got 200 soldiers, you got 200 spearmen. In addition to that, you've got 70 cavalry that's there too. It's I guess you could say the projection of force is something that is key in military planning. And so this commander is wanting to make sure, hey, we're going to project a lot of force here. And not only that, we're going to do this very quickly and very suddenly. Here's the element of surprise. We're getting out of here tonight. We're not waiting until daybreak. And so as all of those things are getting together, notice that in verse number 25, he goes and starts to write this letter. He's going to send Paul to the Roman governor that's there. The Roman governor is going to be in Caesarea, which is just a short distance away. By the way, you go back to the days of Jesus, you had Pontius Pilate that was the governor, right? What was Pontius Pilate doing in Jerusalem instead of in Caesarea? He was just there for Passover. Okay? Normally, the Roman governor would have been in Caesarea. And so, this is where Paul is about to go, but it is Claudius Listus who is the commander, and then to His Excellency Governor Felix. And so Felix has replaced Pontius Pilate. So this is the letter. He says, "Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they are about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I learned that he was a Roman citizen." What? Did you just catch that? Do you think the Roman centurion was kind of covering his hindquarters there? You know, he is really making himself out to be the hero, isn't he? You know, this is not really what went down, but okay, we'll just take it for that. You know, but what it sounds like is that, you know, here's the commander, and all of a sudden the people are attacking Paul, and okay, well, I'm going to go down and I'm going to rescue Paul because I learned that he was a Roman citizen, and I don't want that Roman citizen to be damaged. Okay, we'll just go on with it. So in verse number 28, he says, "I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought them to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusations had to do with questions about their law, but there were no charged against him that deserved imprisonment or death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." And so all of a sudden now it's kind of like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to ship Paul off, and we're going to make him the governor's problem. And everybody who thought that you could do it here, you got to go up there. And so what we see is that starting in verse number 31, is that everybody gets out of town. Verse number 31, it says, "So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antiparis. Then the next day, they let the cavalry go on with him, and they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Caesarea, he said, 'I will hear your case when your accusers get here.' Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace." And so, you know, they go on at night, a little bit away. You know, they stopped, and then daybreak the next day, then those 400 soldiers go back to Jerusalem. And then the cavalry continues on. And so, you know, you've got the main force that's getting him out of town in the cover of darkness. But now all of a sudden, you know, when you don't have the darkness anymore, that the foot soldiers that's going to be slowing them down but giving them added weight, you know, they're going to drop off. And now the cavalry is going to take off and make it up there to the fortress. Okay? And so when he gets there, notice that the governor reads the letter, and he asks what province he's from, which is Caesarea. Now, Caesarea is a long way away from Caesarea. I'm kind of thinking that, you know, the governor was kind of thinking, hey, if he is from a nearby province, I could just keep on pushing him, right? But Caesarea is too far away to do that. And so what's going to happen is, you know, I'm just going to have to hear right here. And so he just simply says, "Okay, Paul, make yourself at home here at Herod's palace. We're going to put a guard with you. And we're just going to wait and see how all of this pans out." All right. You got any questions or comments about any of this?
The 40 men, they went to the chief priests and the rulers and said, "Hey, we're going to kill him." So that was okay with them? I mean...
Oh, the chief priest? Yeah, it is. I mean, they're brutal men. I mean, you know, Paul pointed out the very blatant hypocrisy, and if you've got that blatant hypocrisy when it comes to matters of judgment, you probably got some deeper things there as well, right? And so, you know, if the man is going to, in very plain violation of the law, to strike somebody who's not even condemned, order someone to be punished who's not even condemned, then he really doesn't even care. Okay? And so, yeah, as a matter of fact, I ran across a little note, I think it might have been in my study Bible, that said that Ananias was kind of a very brutal chief priest, a very treacherous chief priest. And you can kind of see it bearing out right here. What I thought you were going to ask is, these 40 men that made an oath not to eat or drink until Paul is dead, they got pretty hungry, didn't they? Yeah, I just kind of wonder what happened to that oath. Here they are the next day. All right, we're going to... What? He's gone? He left at the cover of darkness? Okay, let's go have breakfast. I don't know what they did with the oath, because when you made an oath to God, you needed to fulfill that oath. And this is a very foolish oath, because what happens if you can't fulfill it?
Well, when you're making an oath to God, you're going to kill somebody.
Yes.
To me, there's just a little,
Well, yeah. But when you think about people, and you think about just simply religion, it's something that I've said for many years. Religion doesn't have to make sense, and religion doesn't have to be right. It doesn't have to have any air of goodness or righteousness involved in it. When you think about somebody who their God is their religion, right? They're not really serving the true and the living God anymore. They're not really serving what is right and just and true. They're serving what they think their religion is going to dictate to them. And so here, just like Paul was before he was saved, when he was Saul, here he is persecuting and putting Christians to death and imprisoning them. Why? Because he thought God wanted him to do it. Okay? Well, what was he really doing? He was really being zealous for his religion. Okay? And so these people were doing the same thing, is we're going to kill Paul. Why? Because God wants us to do it? Well, no, we just think God wants us to do it. What we're really doing is we're just being zealous for our religion, and we don't like that person who is going against our religion. And we've got people like that today, don't we? Okay. All right. Other comments or questions?